Good evening. After our excursion into the history of Ukraine, which extended for 6 episodes, this time we'll cross the Atlantic Ocean and deal with the War of 1812, the war between England and America. A war not to be confused with the War of Independence between the same two parties, England and America, which ended officially with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. By the way, England was quite miffed, we would say today, at the Americans, so much so that the English envoy in Paris, sent to Paris to sign the treaty, refused to pose for the portrait. And this is why there is a void, an empty space in the painting commissioned to commemorate the event. Curiously, the War of 1812 is not well known even among Americans. And I draw this conclusion from the fact that when I went to a library to inquire about related books and literature, the librarian asked me, "Do you mean the war against Mexico?" And I said, no, I mean the war between England and America of 1812. Whereupon she said that she did not know too much about it, which is in no way a criticism. There is only so much information that the human mind can process before crashing. And I said this, however, because a historical sketch about the War of 1812 may be of interest not only to our international viewers, I am pleased to say, but maybe also to the domestic viewers of this program. The War of 1812 was in fact the first American war which we can call, without hesitation, imperialist. In this instance, to bring freedom and democracy to Canada by annexing it. Except that, this time, the Canadians would have none of it. But it was also a war in which the fledgling American Navy proved its mettle, especially on Lake Erie and in the St. Lawrence waterway. And it was equally the war during which the Americans burned what today is Toronto, the capital of Canada. Whereupon the English, in retaliation, as we will see later, burned Washington to the ground in a spectacular raid. And the same war will also give birth to the American national hymn, the Star-Spangled Banner. And in the course of the same War of 1812, the Americans took the occasion to tell the remaining Spaniards to get out of the way, meaning the relinquishing of Florida and of what remained of the Spanish colonies along the Gulf of Mexico up to New Orleans. In the end, the War of 1812 finished in a draw. Canada remained independent, and there were no territorial concessions on either side. But there was one big loser, that is, the Native Americans, whose hope for independence and for preserving some of their lands were dashed and crushed forever. After all, Andrew Jackson, later to become President of the United States, summarized the philosophy of the US towards the local inhabitant by the famous quote, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." An objective, that is, physically eliminating the Indians, whose success is expressed by the numbers. It is estimated that when Columbus landed in Hispaniola, the island, the population of Native Americans was 5 million. By the end of the 19th century, they were reduced to less than 500,000, their languages, religions, traditions destroyed, their lands taken, their culture erased from the face of the earth. And the other indirect big losers were the slaves. And why? Because, with or without the American victory at the Battle of New Orleans, a battle that took place after the peace treaty had already been signed, the English, heavily preoccupied with battling Napoleon consented to two things: the acceptance of the Louisiana Purchase as a fait accompli, and the consequent dislodging of the Spaniards from Florida, the Florida Panhandle, that is, and the east coast of the Gulf of Mexico. In turn, this opened Louisiana and the neighboring territories to the intensive cultivation of cotton, which cotton, that is, required even more slaves. And while the Spaniards did still have a foothold in Florida, the slaves who were brave and lucky enough could escape to the Spanish territories where slavery was outlawed. Now, for the slaves, not even the proverbial glimmer of hope remained. Not only, but cotton proved the instrument to build the wealth of America, even in the North, and set the example of ultra-free market and, we could say, unbridled capitalism. For the cultivation of cotton required more slaves than were available. In fact, more or less at this time, the beginning of the 1800s, the slave population was self-reproducing and actually growing, which then led to the prohibition of the importation of slaves from Africa. And you will immediately think that this was a symptom of willingness to consider the slaves as human. No, the reason had to do with what today we would call neoliberal economics. An excess of slave importation from Africa would have depressed the cost of slaves. In fact, it was the consortium of slave traders who promoted the bill for the blocking of the importation of the international slaves. In practice, the cotton fever was so great that the law was easily circumvented by importing slaves not only from Africa, but from the Caribbean. And besides, a large number of slaves was removed from the tobacco fields in the east of the United States and moved to the new promised land of Louisiana. The other way in which the slaves were the losers in the War of 1812 was what today we would call an improvement in management skills and procedures, where the managers were the slave owners and the managed were the slaves. And one of those management novelties was the pushing system in the cultivation of cotton, which more or less consisted of the following. The team commander would set the existing and newly arrived cotton pickers with the fastest picker or weed puller on the left row and all the others on to his right. Then, the team commander would measure the difference in performance between the most efficient and the least efficient of the slaves. At his discretion of the supervisor, he would first flog the least efficient to see how much they could be pushed to perform, hence the name pushing. After this baptism of performance, we could say, he would set a daily schedule for each of the slaves based on the maximum they could produce. And if they did not perform, there was the continual risk of flogging or the actual flogging. But thanks to the pushing system, there was a dramatic increase in efficiency in cotton growing and cotton picking, as this graph clearly shows. In turn, this led to more cotton being available, a reduction in prices, and more people buying cotton garments. We can call it a true triumph of democratic capitalism. Who could ask for more? And this was a short digression into the realm of slavery, but the main theme, as I said, is the actual War of 1812. As usual, and as the great Greek historian Thucydides stated, if you wish to understand the present, you must know the antecedents. And here, in the War of 1812, the antecedents, or if you like, the causes, are, in my view anyway, as interesting as the war itself. And they involve characters and events usually considered alien to the history of America, such as Napoleon Bonaparte himself, and also the first successful rebellion of black slaves in Haiti, and the indirect influence that the Haiti Rebellion had on the famous Louisiana Purchase. But let's go in order and find the start, which we need to find not in America but in Europe, namely in the struggle between England and France, and that is to say the struggle between England and Napoleon. As we know, Napoleon Bonaparte wanted the 19th century to be the French century, just like the masterminds of the project for the new American century, which was or is to be, in the instance, the 21st, the one we're living in. But during the first decade of the 19th century, Napoleon had just about conquered all of Europe except England and Russia. And England still maintained and wanted to maintain supremacy on the seas, attacking French ships and disrupting sea trade with France in general. England needed not only ships but also men to sail them, sailors. And one way was to impress. To impress was the term used, to force any British citizen at sea into service whether he wanted it or not. And you can imagine that in an age where passports were not as common as now, a way to recognize a British subject was the way he spoke. Besides, the matter of whether a British-speaking sailor was English or American, given the youth of the United States themselves, was still a matter of debate. The recruiting system was quite simple. It made use of what were called press gangs. Typically, press gangs went ashore into any friendly and a neutral port. They would call on pubs or brothels to round up likely recruits. But the press gangs called on commercial vessels flying the Union Jack or the flags of other countries, including the United States. And in 1807, a squadron of British ships anchored at the mouth of Chesapeake Bay, waiting for the emergence of two French ships that had been driven into the bay by storms. Since the US was not at war with either England or France, you can imagine hospitality to ships of either nation was an accepted principle. But while the steamship, the HMS Melampus, was in the port of Norfolk, several of its crew chose to desert, and 3 of them enlisted for service with the American frigate called Chesapeake, which was being outfitted for service, believe it or not, in the Mediterranean area against Barbary pirates, against pirates, and which is an interesting fact in itself. They were the forefathers of Al Qaeda. The commander of His Majesty's ships in North America, who was stationed in Halifax, in Nova Scotia, gave order that any ship encountering the Chesapeake at sea should stop her and conduct a search to find the deserters. And such encounter happened at sea between the British frigate Leopold and the Chesapeake. The captain of the Leopold signaled to allow her crew to search the Chesapeake for deserters and sent messengers with this request to the captain of the Chesapeake, whose name was Mr. Barron. Mr. Barron refused, but did not assume a battle position towards the English Leopard, as we said. Eventually, the Leopard opened fire, and the Chesapeake guns remained covered, so they did not reply. The outcome of this, there were three dead sailors, several wounded, and the ship was badly damaged, though it managed to return to port. Not until and after the British had searched the ship and removed the deserters that they were looking for. The British did not take the Chesapeake. That would have been a flagrant act of war. But the incident provoked quite an uproar. In fact, the event proved a catalyst for the nation more than the rhetoric of the Hawks or the war 5 years later. The Americans were looking for revenge later when the British steamship Guerrière impressed an American soldier from a coastal vessel near New York. At that point, the American frigate President president, sailed looking for this British ship, frigate Guerriere, but in the night it took another smaller ship, a sloop called Little Belt. They thought it was the ship they were looking for, the Guerriere, but it was not. The sloop was hit, 9 British sailors were killed and 23 wounded. And this happened in 1811. And having a delayed trade-off, being a delayed trade-off for the Chesapeake incident, it had some kind of revenge, it put the matter to rest. But darker clouds were gathering. At the end of the Revolutionary War, there had been an expansion towards the west, but without formal annexation. By virtue of treaties with various Indian tribes, major chunks of territory had been seized to the U.S., resulting in most of Ohio and Indiana, today's Ohio and Indiana, open to settlements in. Now, in this context, the U.S. accused Britain to use the Native Americans to stop the U.S. advance. No reference, of course, was ever made as to whether the Native Americans had any right to be on their own land. And I quote from a newspaper of the time. "We have but one opinion as to the cause of the depredations of the Indians. They are instigated and supported by the British in Canada, any official declaration to the contrary notwithstanding." And most Westerners, meaning the U.S. pioneers or entrepreneurs, made no secret that they wanted to annex Canada. In fact, even after the Civil War 60 years later, there were those in the American Congress who argued for the annexation of Canada, as Britain had not been completely neutral in the Civil War and had favored the Confederates. The most vociferous, the loudest of the Warhawks was Henry Clay, much later to become himself President of the United States, though, as we will see, his plan to annex Canada did not succeed. Another hawk was the governor of the Indiana Territory, a territory not yet a state, William Harrison, and he managed to get several tribes of Native Americans to cede 3 million acres of land. And one tribe absent in the deal was that of the Shawnee, whose chief was the famous Tecumseh, who dreamt of establishing an Indian confederacy to halt the onslaught of white settlers. He was a brave warrior, so much so that later, during the Civil War of 1861 to 1865, the Union General Sherman added Tecumseh to his name, and this is why he went into history as General William Tecumseh Sherman. Still, in a relatively minor battle at Tippecanoe, Harrison won and destroyed an Indian town. And the consequences of the battle were mostly political. Tecumseh, who up to the time, the Indian leader, who up to the time had dreamt, as I said, to create a confederacy of independent nations, enrolled himself completely on the side of the British, which caused the regime media of the time to write, and I quote, "The war is purely British. The scalping knife and tomahawks of British savages is again menacing our frontiers." A bit too strong, but anyway. So, the Americans had a list of grievances. We saw the business of the impressment of the American sailors, the alleged provocation of Indian unrest, and the seizure of commercial ships. Yes, because as the war between England and Napoleon intensified, the British Navy confiscated any ship directed to France, while Napoleon, on a smaller scale, confiscated any American ship going to England. Now, Britain did not want another war with the United States, and they made several conciliatory concessions, both on the business of the impressment and on the seizure of the ships. But While the British Parliament debated conciliation, the United States debated a declaration of war with the idea of occupying, as I said, of occupying and annexing Canada. The Congress was divided. The states of New England were vehemently opposed to the war because they had prosperous commerce with Canada, and there were even rumors that New England would secede from the United States. Now, viewing the war after 75 years, the American historian Henry Adams wrote, "Many nations have gone to war in pure gaiety of heart, but the United States were first to force themselves into a war that they dreaded in the hope that war itself might create the spirit they lacked." President Madison, who was president at the time, was undecided. But finally he yielded to the Warhawks because he needed their electoral votes in the next election. He also hoped that the declaration would be sufficient to force the British to yield without fighting. And the alleged reason for the war was the seizing of the ships, as we said, and only one paragraph was dedicated to what he called the warfare just renewed by the savages on one of our extensive frontiers. Still, the war was not popular. In an editorial, the federal newspapers, the Republican newspaper, adding a sprinkle of Shakespeare to the article, wrote, "The country has been kicking and screaming by the blind and senseless animosity of a few new-hatched, unfledged comrades who are but boys in public affairs and have never been seen before by the American people on the public stage." Perhaps the most surprised of all was the British ambassador, Augustus Foster, who reported that to his government, "I have to remark on this extraordinary measure that seems to have been unexpected by nearly the whole nation and to have been carried in opposition to the declared sentiments of many over those who voted for it." As I said, the Americans believed that they could achieve their objectives with little annoyance or embarrassment in the effort, as the Secretary of State wrote in a letter. But in fact, the hawk, Henry Clay, said, "The conquest of Canada is in your power. I trust that I shall not be deemed presumptuous when I stated that I verily believe that the militia of Kentucky are alone competent to place Montreal and Canada at your feet." The Americans were convinced that at least half of the Canadians would defeat or join the United States in the invasion of their own country, though the New England states of America were not so sure or impressed, as I said. Wrote the Connecticut Current that was a war commenced in folly, and it was proposed to be carried on with madness, and unless speedily terminated, will end in ruin. Much debate was carried on as to what to do with Canada once it had been annexed. One prevailing opinion was that it should be turned into a colony with less rights than the other states of the United States, a proposition, we may say, oblivious of the fact that the previous war with England had occurred just because the Americans' colonies believed that they had lesser rights than they should. An observation that opens another question. The story of the Revolutionary War issuing in the detachment from England and in the, as you know, in the Declaration of Independence relies heavily on the arguments brought forward by the same declaration. So much so that even the suggesting a critique, not even a criticism, has the sound of an affront, which is certainly not so. And the really starts from the opening statement. All men are created equal, lest the women, because of the time they were not men, even now, Native Americans because they were not white, slaves because they were not human, and the poor because they were not rich. And consequently they had no right to vote. Some other interpretation of the facts of the American Revolution are so well entrenched that to raise questions about them taints the questioner with lack of patriotism. Take, for example, the famous Tea Party. It is assumed and printed in millions of textbooks that the Bostonians threw the tea into the sea because they felt the tax imposed on the tea by Britain to be unfair, which in itself sounds a reasonable explanation. Left untold, however, is a meaningful detail. There was an ample and prosperous contraband business throughout the colonies, and Britain for a long time had mostly decided to close one eye or both eyes. But in the case of tea, however, there was a vast surplus of the commodity in London. So the British decided to lower the price so much that even with the sales tax or stamp tax, the tea would cost less than what it was paid for the contraband merchandise. And it is meaningful that the first person to dish out money for the revolution was John Hancock, whose family had built a fortune in smuggling and in whose house the revolution started. And in the same vein of reassessment, it is rarely or never asked why Britain behaved so badly with the Americans and not with the Canadians. Why did not the Canadians join the Americans to rebel against what was still considered at the time the mother country? The question is, and perhaps should remain unanswered, but it is directly related to the history of the War of 1812. The Canadians have not such intention, however, as we will see in the next episode, when we will follow the development of the war itself. Until then, I thank the crew, and in particular our director, Kat Iverson. Thank you for watching. I am Jimmy Moglia, and see you next time.